Sorry, I'm shouting just to gather everyone's attention. Welcome. I'm Anise Bastiri Tabrizi. I'm the head of the MENA program at RUSI and also an associate at ISPI. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to this panel on what lies ahead for Iran. Obviously, talking about Iran in just 1 hour is going to be a challenge. There is a lot to cover. And I think there are several issues which are going to be crucial moving ahead for the country's future. So I think the first one is obviously the nature of state-society relations. We know that these have been eroded for a number of years now, but obviously over the past few months, as highlighted by the demonstration triggered by the killing of Mahsa Amini, I think this has been particularly clear. We have seen this demonstration expanding into a broader anti-government demonstration, and now we are almost 3 months in of this demonstration taking place. There is also the nature of West-Iran relations, which obviously has significantly worsened over the past few months, partially because of the protests, but also because of Iran's support for Russia, and in particular the provision of drones for its war in Ukraine. Then there is obviously the nuclear issue as well, which has been stalled since September, with meanwhile Iran advancing its nuclear activities and significantly reducing its breakout time to build a nuclear bomb. And finally, there is also, I would say, diminishing prospect for de-escalation across the region, and this can be highlighted by, for instance, the halting of the talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also the election of Bibi Netanyahu as prime minister, with arguably an increase of the perception of threat from outside and from across the region from an Iranian point of view. So this looks like a recipe for escalation of tensions on multiple fronts. And I think there is definitely a lot to cover when we look at Iran, but we have an excellent panel that will help us unpack these issues, and I hope also they will provide us with a glimmer of hope about what lies ahead for the country. With us today we have Rob Malley, the US Special Envoy for Iran, Bruno Scholl, head of the Iran division at the External Action Service, Ali Gheramayeh, who is the deputy head of the MENA program at ECFR, and Maria Van Tappie, who is the special advisor for the MENA program at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Welcome, everyone. Rob, I'll start with you, if that's okay. Obviously, Biden started his mandate with a commitment to renew diplomacy with Iran in an attempt to restore the nuclear deal. But as early as mid-October this year, the US has stated that reviving the JCPOA is no longer the focus of the US right now. Can you tell us a little bit about how the demonstration and Iran support for Russia have changed the US policy on Iran? What is the plan, and where is the US policy on Iran likely to go?
Okay, a lot of questions. I'm not sure I'll get to all of them, but first, thank you for having me on the panel. As you said, a lot happening and not much that is room for optimism at this point. I would start by saying that Iran, over the last months more, has made a series of choices and is living with the consequences of those choices. It made a decision to respond to the protest of its people demanding respect for fundamental rights, dignity, by using brute force rather than dialogue. They made the decision of walking away from a deal that was on the table not just once, twice, 3 times, and not a deal that the US was putting on the table, but that the EU and we have their representative here, that had been accepted by Russia and China, not particularly close to the US, but and historically closer to Iran. They've all said it was a fair deal, and they rejected it on at least 2 or 3 occasions, most recently in August. They made the decision of not cooperating with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to try to respond and to clarify some outstanding questions. They made the decision to support, as you said, Russia in its war of aggression against Ukraine. They made the decision to continue to target Americans, former and current officials, and they made the decision that's affected so many countries, including Italy, of detaining foreigners, choose them as hostages. So those are the decisions that Iran has made over the past few months, and they're living with the consequences. cutting themselves off from their own people and from much of the international community. What we've said, the impact it has on the US, of course, we're going to react to all those issues independently of one another as forcefully as we need to. If they're threatening Americans, if they're violating human rights, if they're supporting Russia's war of aggression, we will respond to those. What happened on the nuclear file, just very briefly, as I said, we were very close. I think Bruno could attest to that. And then in August, once again, Iran came up with a extraneous issue, something that had nothing to do with the JCPOA, this question of the outstanding issues that the IAEA was investigating. And at that point, they really walked away from the deal. They took the deal off the agenda. And since then, the two things that have happened, which have grabbed our attention, we were not going to continue to focus on a deal that was not moving because every time we made progress, Iran walked away from it. The protests and the repression of the protests, and the support for Russia's war against Ukraine. That's where our focus is because that's where things are happening, and that's where we want to make a difference. So we're keeping the door open to diplomacy because meanwhile, they are continuing to expand their nuclear program for no justifiable civilian purpose. So we have to address that. The door is open for diplomacy. That's the commitment President Biden made when he came into office. It's still his commitment to this day, but it takes two to make diplomacy. And at this point, while the door is open, the deal is not on the agenda, even though it remains on the table because of Iran's approach. And everything that's happened since, as you say, has just made the situation even more complicated.
Thank you. Bruno, obviously, we know that Europe has played a significant role as a mediator between the two sides since years, especially since 2003, when the whole nuclear issue started, but even before, when we were talking about critical dialogue, constructive dialogue, really Europe positioned itself as a mediator between the two sides and always chose engagement with Iran as its preferred policy, even when it was at odds with the United States. Now, there are growing signs that Europe might be changing direction. Sanctions have been adopted recently because of protests and because of the deployment of drones, as we mentioned. And there have been also statements, especially from Germany's foreign ministry, about the fact that it can no longer be business as usual with Iran. So my question to you is this trend across Europe actually shared, or is it something that features only in a few countries? Are we seeing a move away from diplomacy into more pressure, isolation?
Thanks. Thanks for having me, first of all. And you're right that the fundamental disposition of the European Union and Europeans is to try to mediate, talk, keep channels open. And let me start saying this is still the case. Rob and yourself, you have pointed out some fundamental developments that have happened in the past month. And starting with the violent clampdown of the protest, with the delivery of military gear to Russia. And these are things, I think the Iranians, at the very least, the delivery of the military equipment to Russia have underestimated what this means for Europeans. I think they have, we told them, I think since March, what it would mean if Iran would side with Russia in the war of aggression against Ukraine. That this would touch a nerve of Europeans, that it would be difficult to just maintain the position as we had. So we responded to this, we responded to the clampdown of the protests. But let me also say this is not new. This is a standing European policy that we have had all along, that we are critical with Iran when we disagree on things. We had also human rights sanctions after the protests in 2019. We do this, we continue to do this, and at the same time we say it loud and clear, we are ready to engage when interests align, and on the JCPOA this is a case where we still think interests align and where we are ready to keep the door open and negotiate. Of course, political circumstances have changed as well, and Rob alluded to this, but we still think we need to pursue the path and try to find this diplomatic solution. And for us, the JCPOA is still the best direction to go towards. And I think that is where we are.
Thank you. Ali, I know that you have been looking at this potential shift, and you have been always working on the EU policy on Iran. What do you think is the direction now, and do you think that it could backfire if we move away from diplomacy, especially on the nuclear issue, but in general? Is there a potential that this could actually increase the escalation rather than just signal a political stance?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you again, Anise, for inviting us and bringing this panel together. So I have to say, as someone who's been watching this story unfold since 2012, I think we're at a real low point for diplomatic options on the Iran-Western front. And the Europeans, to their credit, I think did an incredible job during the 4 years of the Trump administration, holding the JCPOA framework together through primarily political investment, despite the shortcomings on the economic front. And we're in this phase where I think there was tremendous hope that with an incoming new US administration, there would be a swift pivot towards real diplomatic opening. What we have seen over the past almost 2 years of negotiations now under the new US administration and Iran is there has been time after time of missed opportunities, I think, on both sides. And the longer this saga has continued, the more, I think, external factors outside the JCPOA have poisoned the atmosphere of the talks and are raising the political stakes, frankly, for both the US, Iran, and the Europeans now to re-engage in this process. My own reading is that right now, the E3 governments and the US is perhaps far too pessimistic about the possibilities for diplomacy, and the Iranian side is far too optimistic about it. And we need to find some sort of a band-aid, let's say, at least on the nuclear issue, in the immediate months coming ahead to try and prevent a major escalation. Iran has already, in the past 6 months, made significant escalatory moves in response to what it sees as pressure moves, censures from the US and Europeans, which I think are correct, by the way, in response to issues outside of the JCPOA. But nevertheless, Iran is on an escalatory pathway when it comes to its nuclear advancement. And what I say to those that are advocating for shutting all the doors of diplomacy, particularly now increasing pressure on European governments to cut diplomatic ties, to bring out, their envoys out of Iran, is that where does that actually get us to? How does that help us take away Iran's nuclear cards, which, if we think we have problems now with Tehran, imagine what that would be if Iran were to become a nuclear weapon state, which, we are now, based on some calculations, just days away from Iran having enough nuclear weapons grade material for one nuclear bomb. And it should be shocking to all of us that this is the place we are at. Now, my sense is that there are some in both Tehran and in Washington that think a no crisis, no deal situation is sustainable for a long time, and that actually neither side wants to face the high political costs domestically that would be imposed on them to re-engage in a diplomatic initiative right now. But my sense is that the Europeans need to play their traditional mediating role at this stage, at this very sensitive and urgent stage, and keep the space open, at least for some narrow diplomacy, as I said, to prevent escalation, which could essentially tie all our hands for the foreseeable future in maintaining this escalatory approach rather than climbing down the ladder. We need an off-ramp, and I still think that the Europeans are a party that can pursue that.
Thank you, Ali. Maria, moving to the regional perspective, obviously with the potential move away from dialogue from both the EU and the US, there is a lot of question about what is the likely response by countries in the region. There is, less prospect of an external guarantor. We know that there have been talks about a potential regional security framework. I know there is also a panel after hours that we discuss this more in detail. But do you think there is any likelihood that countries in the region will respond by taking themselves the role of de-escalating, not seeing the external guarantor as an option anymore? Ownership of engagement, bilateral initiatives, or like I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia in particular. I know that obviously the talks direct between Iran have been halted, but At the same time, there have been indirect talks between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. There has been this maritime agreement between Israel and Hezbollah. So are we seeing that as a potential for de-escalation rather than having a security external guarantor coming in and fixing everything in the region?
Thank you, Anise. And first of all, let me start by saying that I think that it's very important to set to establish the fact that the protests happened at a time when already some geopolitical dynamics were in place. So there was an ongoing stepped up escalation between Israel and Iran. Israel had started actually this to shift from deterrence to encirclement along all Iran borders from Azerbaijan to Iraq up until the Gulf. So that definitely, in the moment in which protests happen, I think that already the fact that this dynamic was in place, it sort of gave an opportunity to the government in Iran to see this as an externally driven movement or to portray that as such. So I think that there are three risks ahead. One is that I think that if what will be Iran reactions moving forward, and I think that one risk is that the response to the protests will be that one of actually fueling the escalation. So there will be more and more escalation alongside the borders with Iran, and we have seen also already bombings in Iraqi Kurdistan, heightening tension with Azerbaijan. But also moving towards the Gulf, I think that there is a second risk, which is that all the effort for dialogue, so all the effort for having a Gulf-Iran dialogue that have happened over the past 1.5 years will be undermined, precisely because of this perception that there is actually a regional plan to undermine stability within the borders of Iran. And I think that the third aspect is also the fact that because there is this growing shift of Iran towards a securitized position, and that will also fuel the dynamic whereby Iran will becoming closer and closer to Russia. And I think that we have to consider both as European, but also beyond that, what are the consequences of a growing global polarization? What does that mean really for global security, the fact that Iran will increasingly shift toward the Russian side? But going back to your question, I do think that there is a lot of space, especially when it comes to Gulf-Iran relations, to open up really dialogue between these two parts, between members of the GCC, who really see that if an escalation will happen, if Iran will shift back towards a securitized position, if there will be an Iran-Israel escalation happening, that will happen at the expenses of the Gulf security. And therefore, I do think that there are many wise voices within GCC countries that really look at options of keeping the door open still with Iran, while obviously working towards military deterrence. However, the future of these channels of dialogue also depend, as Rob was saying, on the behaviors of Iran in some way. So, but I do think that there is still an option for this. And as Ellie was also mentioning, I do think that the European should do everything that is possible to continue supporting these channels of de-escalation between the Gulf and Iran.
Thank you, Maria. Rob, can I press a little bit more on the U.S. policy and what, if not diplomacy and engagement? Plan Bs, going towards escalation. We heard a lot of scenarios on what it could happen with the tensions both across the region, but also with Iran and the West. And we also have seen a U.S. shift, if you wish, on its policy in the region, with President Biden initially having a stance on Saudi Arabia, but also on the Yemen war, and then most recently traveling to the region and re-engaging with Saudi Arabia, having that kind of I would say more forward approach with Gulf countries as well compared to the beginning. So I guess my question is, what is the US policy towards, where does Iran sit on where does Iran sit on the US policy across the MENA region right now?
So first, I'm not sure there's been that much of a shift that you described, but let me, I've never liked the expression Plan B because it makes it sound like you're in one world where everything is is focused on diplomacy and another world in which nothing is focused on diplomacy. I think we've always been in a different world, somewhere in between. Even while we were negotiating the JCPOA, the media was all focused on that, which is why people thought that's all that we were doing. But we were taking other steps together with our GCC partners and others in the region to counter Iran's actions, destabilizing actions in the regions, to sanction them for human rights violations, for their ballistic missile program, and so on and so forth. So we were always preparing for both, and today it's true. There's less hope for a deal, so there's more of an emphasis on some of the other aspects, but also Iran's behavior has triggered more of the rest. I mean, 2 years ago, they were not supporting a war of aggression in Europe, and they were not taking some of the other steps that they're taking, even in the region, whether it's the attacks against Iraq sovereignty, or the threat to go after Saudi Arabia. So I think there's a continuum, it's a spectrum in which diplomacy is always part of the tools. I agree with everything that's been said. We have to keep that door open, because at the end of the day, history has shown the only way to sustainably deal with Iran's nuclear program. And again, as Eli said, imagine what the situation in the region would be like if you had a nuclear weapon-armed Iran. At the end of the day, diplomacy is the best way to resolve it, and we still believe that. Diplomacy is still the best way to get our hostages out of Iran, so we don't want to cut that channel either. But as I said, the other parts of our policy are going to have to be front and center to deter and counter Iran's activities. We've always been doing it. I think you'll see more of it now just because of the shifting context. But one more comment you've asked about regional engagement. It's also been a constant of the Biden administration from the minute he came into office of encouraging countries in the region to engage with Iran in order to de-escalate tensions. And that is independent of whatever may be happening on the other files. We think it's the right thing. We think it's the right thing for countries in the region to send Iran the message, the same message that we're sending, which is the door to diplomacy is open, but if they don't change their behavior on certain files, relationship with Gulf countries will have a real ceiling. You're not going to see economic integration if Iran is under sanctions from the US, and Iran will remain under the secondary sanctions for as long as we don't have a deal. So everything is interconnected, but I don't think that there's been a fundamental shift. I think from day one, President Biden told us, let's see if we could resolve this diplomatically, but let's be prepared for a world in which the JCPOA is revived, or a world in which the JCPOA is not revived, and it's not going to be black and white. It's going to be somewhere in between.
Thanks. Similar question to you, Bruno. I mean, one of the consideration was that the JCPOA, if agreed and restored, could lead to talks about regional issues, right? Ballistic missile, Iran support for proxies. Now we are obviously far from any kind of move from a nuclear issue that is not being discussed into resolving diplomatically these issues that I mentioned. So the question to you is really like, what are the considerations from the EU about how to deal with these threats? And are we seeing these as the main threats still, or is there any other threat that is more impelling, say Ukraine, for instance?
Oh, thank you. Earlier this year, about I think in June, we came up with what we call the new strategy for partnership with the Gulf, the European Union. It took a while to come out with it because we were always hoping we would close the JCPOA before that. And exactly what you described would happen, that this would change a bit the climate, this would change the opportunities to work with the Iranians on regional issues. It didn't happen at that time. There are still two lines, I think, worth quoting. The first one is Iran is central to the security in the region. And the second is any steps for de-escalation have to be inclusive. Now, this is a big challenge, and I think the biggest challenge for the regional security still comes from a nuclear crisis for the European Union, which is why we think the restoration of the JCPOA is still very important to achieve. Then we have, of course, the other destabilizing activities of Iran that we have heard, the work with the proxies in the regions, the delivery of weapons, the violation of territorial sovereignty that we have recently seen. So that led us also to the conclusion we need to start working with our GCC partners, but keep the door open to have a more inclusive forum or a more inclusive way whenever we are at the position with the Iranians. We have tried to do that before on maybe some low intensity issues, environmental issues, maritime safety, but we didn't get very far, admittedly. We worked with the Iranians a bit on Yemen a couple of years ago. It went a little bit further, but maybe there is a way to restart this. We have now a forum, was spearheaded by the French, but the EU is now fully on board to the Baghdad conference. Maybe it's a way at least to have everybody around the table and start interacting, engaging again, and I think we're seeing attempts to continue this forum. And lastly, maybe to say, we are about to appoint an envoy in the European Union, a special representative for Gulf security, who is not only dealing with GCC and member countries, but also should develop relations with Iran. So we're trying, we are pursuing diplomacy, we are pursuing different strands, but so far, as everybody can see in plain light, we're not quite there yet.
Thank you. Ali, can I build on something that Maria has mentioned, Iran-Russia relations? Obviously, we have seen a growing relation between them, but there is question about where this is going. Are we seeing a strategic partnership? Is this going into some sort of actual alliance, or are we seeing this as a response to current developments, both with the halting of talks with the West, protests, increase of threat across the region? Is this a simple response from Iran, but nothing more than that, or are we moving towards a strategic partnership between the two?
Sure. I mean, look, I think that Iran's leadership from the very top has wanted to secure a deepened relationship with Russia for over a decade. And this was really accelerated following the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, where it essentially forced the gravity of conversation inside Tehran to seeing the Eastern powers, both China and Russia, as Iran's main global partners in their effort to confront the United States, but also build an alternative economic framework that bypasses US secondary sanctions, which has been used to weaken all these groups of countries. So that motivation has been there for a long time. And in this tug of war internally inside Iran about whether to really go back into the nuclear deal or not, under what conditions, in which, in their view, there are really no guarantees that a future US administration would not withdraw once again from the nuclear deal. I think there has been, an accelerated push inside Iran for deepening ties with Russia and China for both security, political, and economic reasons. Now, I think Iranian decision makers were confronted with a very critical choice when the Russian aggression in Ukraine began. In my view, they fundamentally made the wrong choice in terms of how they have decided to be essentially the only country in the world that has provided military support to Russia that is being used in this conflict. And I think they are bearing huge costs for their relationship, particularly with Europe on that front. But nevertheless, I think they are using this situation to drive forward their relationship with Russia. Right now as we speak, there's a parallel conference in Moscow where there is Iranian representatives there, and unfortunately they're not here to explain their positions and be pressed on their positions. And we're seeing it on the trade front as well. When I speak to economists looking at the relationship, there has always been doubts about how far the economic relationship is going, but nevertheless, it has accelerated, and we'll have to see where that goes. But in my view, Iran's, as I said, it's a fundamental mistake, and it has carried huge costs, but Iran's current degree of, let's say, partnership with Russia over Ukraine has not, in my view, been a game changer for the Ukraine conflict. What will be a game changer for the world and the region will be if Iran becomes a nuclear weapon state. And so again, this is why I think that we need to find a band-aid solution on the nuclear front, because again, all of these other areas of problems become significantly more difficult to address. I'll just end by saying something that I think that this is the time to perhaps influence the debate inside Iran for a course correction on Russia. We are seeing it in the public debate, on social media and elsewhere, that there is a pushback to what is being perceived increasingly inside Iran, even amongst the elite, that Iran is putting all of its eggs in the Russian and the Chinese basket. So there is, I think, a conversation, an internal conversation to be impacted there. I think the fact that the US and Europeans are regularly producing intelligence on Iranian activities in Ukraine is influencing that debate and that push for course correction. And on the European side, right now, we need at least some high degree of private consultation with the Iranians to really draw the red lines of what is going to trigger, I think, a much more forceful response on the European and the American side if Iran deepens this military cooperation with Russia, because I think those communications are not happening clearly enough, and that this could cause Tehran to really miscalculate even further on this conflict.
Thanks, Ali. Maria, I wonder if you can talk a little bit, what's the perception about, these Iran-Russia relations from regional countries? Is there any impact in their calculation, like in terms of how they perceive Iran as a threat? Obviously, we know that the Gulf countries in particular have seen Iran as a threat because of its role in supporting proxies in the region, of being an intervention country across conflict in the region. But has Iran-Russia relations, the support for the Ukraine war, and the provision of drone change the calculations across the Gulf towards Iran at all?
Well, a difficult question, I think, because this is in the making, so it's very difficult to actually address this question in an exhaustive way. But I will say that there might be concern from maybe from Israel of how this, to a certain extent, how this intensifying relation between Iran and Russia is going to leave Iran more safe space for action in settings that are, in theaters of conflict that are very close to Israel, for instance, southern Syria, and how instead Israel will have to somehow pay the price for this and will have less margin of actions in Syria. So definitely that is part of the calculation. When it comes to Gulf country, I think been with some others in Manama 2 weeks ago, and it was quite clear the message that came from there, that most of the GCC countries, they really want to continue to be not drawn in the Ukraine-Russia conflict and want to continue to actually have a channel of communication to Russia. So I'm not sure that actually it's perceived that Iran-Russia relation is still perceived as a threat. But I do think that when it comes to Russia-Iran relations and how this could impact the stability of the entire region, here there is a point to make. Even if Russia, which is important for European security, even if Europeans, they feel very confident of what's how the war is unfolding in Ukraine and the victories that are done on the ground, I do think that there is a calculation to be made also from the European side, the extent to which this deepening Russia-Iran relation is also, or this deepening Russia-Iran relation, but also this the fact that Russia, anyway, even if it's taking a passive position of no longer deconflicting, for example, between Israel and Iran, or letting, for example, Turkey to be more operative within the Levant. So basically, more and more we see that Russia is letting the medium regional power, Iran on one side, but also Turkey, to operate within the Levant and to let conflict unfold. So this, I think, could really deepen the already dire situation of conflict across the entire Levant. And definitely it's relevant for European security. So we should, in another way, think on how, in some way, whether even if there are some victories happening on the Eastern Front, instability may come from the Southern Front.
Thank you. Rob, looking at the protests, can you tell us a little bit about the US assessment about what this means for Iran? Are we seeing really a turning point for Iran because of this demonstration?
So I'm not in the business of predictions, not in the role I have now, but I think there are a few things that are incontrovertible. I mean, this is an extraordinary movement which has lasted longer, been more widespread, been more courageous, and been more creative than any that we have seen before. And it certainly is one that the regime doesn't know how to deal with. It shows brutality, it shows violence, it shows sexual violence, it shows a whole host of measures that have not tamped down the willingness of Iranians, particularly young women and girls, to protest for their fundamental demands. So where this goes, I'm not gonna predict, but already I think it has outlasted what many believed it would, and I think it's a very fundamental moment. And as we've said before, this is a page of Iran's history that is being written by the Iranian people. It's not being written in Washington, it's not being written in Rome or in Brussels, it's being written in Iran. And the way we define our role as the United States, and I think it's the same for Europeans, is to support the fundamental rights of people of Iran, as we should support the fundamental rights of people everywhere, and to sanction those in Iran who are responsible for gross human rights abuses and human rights violations and violence in prisons or elsewhere, to put a spotlight to make sure that everyone knows what's happening, even at a time when the Iranian regime is trying to hide what's happening by cutting off social media, cutting off the internet. We made sure that our own sanctions would not stand in the way of that. And multilateralizing this support so that Iran can't say it's a Western plot. It's European countries, the United States, it's Chile, it's countries from the global south. We saw it in the vote of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. I think we'll see it again in the commission, in the vote to exclude Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women. So this is not a West versus Iran. It's many across the globe who are supporting the Iranian people. So that's our take on it.
Thanks, Rob. Bruno, probably same question for you, but more like I would like to know what is it that the West can do really to help or should do to help demonstration besides sanctions, besides condemnation? Is there anything more that can be done and should be done, or maybe it's better that it should be left alone and like dealt with internally?
Well, you already alluded to some things that have been done, which is not leaving it alone. I think it is first of all very important to call it out publicly, and also in our direct contacts, which we have done from day one. We met at the highest levels with the Iranians in New York at the General Assembly at president's level to directly call this out. We do it publicly in our statements, also at 27, that this is not tolerable, and also, as Rob said, it is us supporting fundamental human rights, the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly. These are things that we do support, and we use sanctions also as a way to signal this to the population too. We use targeted sanctions. We list individuals who are responsible for the oppression. The second avenue is accountability. Also here, it's not leaving things alone. We have the Human Rights Council establishing a fact-finding mission. Now we will have to work also collectively internationally that this fact-finding mission actually gets to the facts. This will be difficult because the Iranians have already reacted quite negatively, but still these are the places where the international community has to act. And we also, by having the discussions, bringing it into the public sphere, I think this can help the movement. Now, getting inside Iran to help, I don't think this is business that we are in. We are not even represented in Tehran. So far, we haven't been allowed to open an EU delegation, even if we have 140 around the world. So also, we shouldn't overestimate what we would do on the ground. It is to support the fundamental rights of the people to stand up for what they believe in, for the fundamental rights, for equality, and to ensure accountability.
Thanks, Bro.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'll just add a few thoughts. I think for those who have studied Iran's history over the last 100 years, I think one lesson is to be very humble about predictions of what's going on the ground and be open to any number of possibilities that could come out from what we're seeing play out in Iran. I think one of the biggest concerns that I have looking at this is the number of minors that have been killed during these protests. So according to some human rights groups at the moment, there's over 400 deaths as a result of these protests and the violence used, including over 60 minors who have been killed in the last 3 months of protests. So I think particularly shining the spotlight on that front from a European perspective will be very important, and pushing for accountability on that front, whether it's at the UN or other platforms, will be incredibly important. And another area which is, I think, of increasing concern is the growing number of death penalty sentences being issued for the detainees. Again, that's another area where both through diplomacy but also through targeted sanctions policy, very strong messages should be sent. And I think in the case of Iran, it will be exceptionally important for the US and Europe to work with other members of the international community to bring the spotlight on Iran. And this is why the latest vote at the UN is, I think, of significance for messaging inside Tehran. I'll just finish off by also saying that, look, clearly, from what we're seeing from the footage on the ground coming out from Iran, there is revolutionary sentiment being expressed on the streets. Now, whether this is the start of a revolution that could take many, many years or a short number of months, no one, I think, can tell with certainty. But what I think is important in this context is ensuring that, at least from the European side, that continues to have ears and eyes on the ground to understand what's going on, to maintain that channel of understanding on the ground. Not only is that important to give us clear intelligence and point us to the right directions on policy making, but also it's important on very practical issues, like ensuring that visas are being issued for some of these Iranian protesters that want to leave the country, or ensuring that at least a certain degree of communication and support can be offered on the ground. And finally, I would say an area that the US has really pushed on, and I think there is room for the Europeans also, is to look at the degree of support that can be given in the tech and communication sector, which includes sanctions relief, which includes heavy dialogue and consultation with the tech sector on this front going forward. And it's a demonstration that the isolation of Iran under unprecedented decades of sanctions doesn't always help agents for change that are on the ground.
Thanks, Ali. Well, Maria, you already alluded to some of these aspects, but I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about what is the likely impact of what is happening inside Iran on Iran's foreign policy. You alluded to the strikes in Iraq, and this is what I think in particular, obviously these were already taking place, but have been intensified over the past few months, allegedly in response to the fact that Iran believes that sedition movements within Iraq are fomenting the demonstration. There is a possibility that this could also replicate elsewhere, especially in the neighboring countries. And you mentioned the securitized approach, which might be also driving Iran's policy more in the region. Can you tell us a little bit more in detail about that?
Yes, I mean, the risk of this increasingly securitized position of Iran, it's obviously the fact that increasingly, especially in a bordering area where there are ethnic minorities, then Iran will increasingly perceive the protest, or want to perceive or to portray the protest as foreign-driven. Therefore, I think that we can expect a flashpoint of confrontations happening more and more at the border between Iran and Iraq in the Kurdish area. So continued bombings happening on the areas where Iran Kurdish opposition movements are located, but also a worsening relation with Azerbaijan. So also the Caucasus will be an important area of increasing tension. And I will say also the third third theater of heightening tension is the attempt of Iran to increasingly come closer to Israel. So pose a security threat to Israel that is closer to home, whether from the south of Syria or even domestically within the West Bank. So this is another potential threat. And obviously, if really there is no progress and there is no investments into the channel of Gulf Iran negotiation, then talks, then also we can expect the truce in Yemen to continue not to be actually extended, and so tension returning in the Gulf. So we can see different flashpoints of confrontations, which are obviously highly concerning, I think. And just to build on what Ellie also said, I do think that we need to understand how, on the one hand, support for protest and demands for accountability for protest, it's not mutually exclusive from another policy line, which is continued channel of diplomacy to try to settle the nuclear issue and also to try to continue to support de-escalation in the region. We can see that many of the Gulf countries, actually, they are managing, on the one hand, the fact that they have military deterrence and also diplomacy with Iran. I do think that we should, I say as European, try to understand how to balance also these different tools and not just think that one is mutually exclusive to the other.
Thank you, Maria. Well, one final round with a brief sentence from each of you. And Rob, I would start with you with really, like, what would it take for Iran to do so that the US resumes diplomacy?
So that's not going to be just one sentence, sorry, but there's another panel going on right now on the Gulf, which I was supposed to be on, and I think, I can't be on both at the same time, but there are some positive things that are happening. The positive, there may be different views, but the Abraham Accords in terms of normalization between Israel and some Arab states, the reconciliation within the GCC, the dialogue now between Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, UAE, I mean, there's a forward movement. You asked about President Biden's policy. It's one of trying to have stronger ties with countries throughout the region, not just on security, although security is a very important issue, the whole issue of interoperability of maritime and naval security, but also on food security, environmental security, clean energy. There's a lot that's happening. And Iran could have had a choice to be somewhat part of it. Maria's spoken a lot about dialogue between the GCC and Iran. They could have taken a different path in Vienna. They could have taken a different path in so many ways. They made the decision. They made a series of choices that have been very consequential and which are leading us to this very negative dynamic in relation to Iran when other dynamics, some of them, not all of them, but some of them are moving in a positive direction. Choices that are made can be unmade. Iran can unmake some of the choices it's made. It's hard to see. I mean, I have to admit, I have to be candid, given we're sort of in a vicious cycle. The more Iran represses, the more there'll be sanctions. The more there's sanctions, the more Iran feels isolated, the more will turn to Russia. The more it turns to Russia, the more sanctions there will be. The more the climate deteriorates, the less likely that we'll have a nuclear diplomacy. So it's true that right now the vicious cycles are all self-reinforcing. But these are all choices that leaders make. They're bad choices, but they're also more positive choices, and we will continue to keep the door open for diplomacy. We'd never shut it down, but we're not going to choose diplomacy at the expense of standing up for what we believe is right, whether it's in Iran or in Ukraine or in the region. And again, at some point, the Iranian leadership is going to have to make a decision. Is it going to continue down this path, which, as I said, is isolating it increasingly from its own people and from large parts of the international community? Or are they gonna change?
Thank you. Bruno, do you think that this transatlantic alliance that there is now on Iran is going to continue? Or do you see any risk following 2024 elections of a replication of a Trump scenario of disalignment between the EU and the US? And is the EU preparing at all for that kind of scenario?
Well, now we're shifting from Iran to the US, and making predictions about the US seems to be even more difficult than Iran. No, but I think the transatlantic alliance it's strong when it comes to the human rights. It is strong when it comes to the question of Ukraine. On the JCPOA, actually, it was wider than a transatlantic alliance. We also had China and Russia on board. With the ideas put forward in restoring the JCPOA, and we came in touching distance. So it's not only the transatlantic, and sometimes the trick of the whole story was to go wider. and to have a wider audience. We talked about the human rights, where it is important to go wider than the transatlantic. And I think to try and build these broader coalitions is very important. And the Iranians can, of course, do steps that can help. Rob alluded to some. Some are bigger, some are smaller. A smaller step could be they could finally start working with the agency on the outstanding safeguards issue. It's not something that would take too much of a climb down. I could say maybe this would bring some others in more difficult positions to respond, but at least it would change dynamics a little bit. The bigger things, of course, is it would be a good start if they stop providing weapons to Russia. It would be a good start to stop repression at home. But these are the big considerations in Iran. I think starting with the small ones could already help.
Thank you. Ali, do you think that Iran is even interested in still leaving the door open for diplomacy with the West? Or do you think that they moved past beyond that and they are now in a trajectory in which they believe it's better to invest on their relations elsewhere and even on the JCPOA not to be restored at all?
So look, I think Iran has had multiple chances, since President Trump withdrew from the deal to pull the plug on the JCPOA. And they have consistently maintained that that is not what they want to do, despite the fact that in response to reimposed US sanctions, they have essentially hollowed out by now the nuclear components of the agreement. But I think as a political concept, they still see value in a restoration of the nuclear deal. Look, diplomacy is always a very, very difficult choice, especially when it's with an adversary country. The US and Iran know this fully well, given what happened under Obama and President Rouhani. And I think in the last 2 years, we have had missed opportunity from both sides. So President Biden came in with a very strong mandate from the Democratic Party to go back into the nuclear deal, and that could have been something that was done in the first 100 days when the former President Rouhani administration was also still in government. But there was a resistance, I think, on the US side to pay some of the heavy political costs that were required as the first gestures of good faith to the Iranian side, having been the party that left the agreement. Anyway, so let's leave history beside. I do think right now Tehran needs to read the room and understand that A, they have most to lose from the JCPOA not being restored, and also that they, in these current optics, need to be the first mover to come with some serious concrete proposals on how the JCPOA could be restored. And if not, then I think on the European side and the US side, we need to think about a band-aid solution that, as I said, prevents escalation. And some of the ideas that have been proposed, which I think may work and are worth pursuing in a diplomatic endeavor, is a step-by-step measure that doesn't go into the JCPOA saga, but looks at measures that Iran can take primarily on increasing our eyes and ears on the ground regarding its nuclear program through IAEA inspections and restoring the intensified inspections that used to exist until last year. And for the US and the Europeans to look at creative measures where some economic relief can be provided in Iran as part of a step-for-step measure. This doesn't have to be a grand move on either side, but we need to start from something in order to ensure that we are not left with the very unpalatable option of Plan Bs and going back into talking about military strikes on Iran's nuclear program, which is something that was really hot on the minds in 2003 and in 2011. So we've been here before, we've seen how the story goes, and we need to prevent that trajectory.
Thanks, Ali. Maria, the last word to you, really building on what Ali has been saying about.
Yeah, I can only say that I think maybe one point that I want to stress again is also how important is the line of stability that comes from within the region. I do think that, and I hope that Iran also evaluates the risk and backlash that a securitizing position could have in its relations also with the Gulf countries. And I do think that this will really contradict the purpose also and the statements of this Raisi government when it says that it wanted to do regional diplomacy. I do think that it's very important that they evaluate the benefits of having a nuclear deal to actually drive the economic integration with the Gulf, and the benefits to actually keep open the door of dialogue with the Gulf to continue this process of regional diplomacy. Without this cannot happen. And on the other hand, I think that the Gulf countries also are very well placed to have a dialogue among themselves on how to balance, on the one hand, normalization with Israel for those who have normalized, so investments also in military deterrence, but also on the other hand, keeping the door open for diplomacy with Iran. So these elements of stability that comes from within the region, which makes the Gulf an integrated space, I do think that it's so important as an initiative that should come from both players, but also supported definitely by both the US and Europe.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we ran out of time, but we are exactly on time, so I don't know if we did justice to really providing a glimmer of hope when it comes to Iran, but we certainly unpacked a lot of these issues, so I really encourage you to join me in thanking our panelists for this brilliant session.
Recording in progress.